everyone, and welcome to Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Episode 17?
18.
18?
Yeah.
Oh, we're getting old. Episode 18 of Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. We're now going to talk about, me and Christian and Zach, are going to talk about Paths of Glory, which is a 1957 anti-war film directed by Stanley Kubrick and based on Humphrey Cobb's novel. And it concerns Colonel Dax commanding the 701st Infantry Regiment in France during World War I, and he's played by Kirk Douglas, and he's defending his men against charges of cowardice in a court-martial, which was brought about by General Miro, divisional commander, and who is played by George Macready. The film also stars Adolphe Menjou as General Brulard, Baguette, Corps Commander. So, believe it or not, the first question is, what were your overall impressions of the film, boyos?
I don't believe it. Yeah. I would say that I really enjoyed this. It might be my least favorite of the Kubrick I've seen. I haven't seen all of his movies, but I've seen a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And I would say it might be my least favorite, but even lesser Kubrick, I think, is really well made, and you have to admire how precisely it's filmed and edited and put together. The man really was an artist, and I admire that in basically all of his movies. In particular, in this movie, there's lots of really impressive wide follow shots and tracking shots in the trenches and at parties, and I think those do a great job at kind of stressing the literary and theatrical nature of this story, rather than embracing a lot of quick cuts and trying to make it really action-packed and cinematic. I mean, I also really like the performances. I think all around this is a pretty great film, even if some aspects of it are a little dated purely because of just the methods of the time that it was made.
Yeah,
Christian?
I liked it too. Yay! I liked the movie. I gave this a 3 out of 5, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. Usually, or maybe not usually, but sometimes with these older films, I get impatient and I accuse it of being boring, but this time I did not do that because I think that while sometimes the acting was maybe a little hammed up, and just generally I think in film and in pretty much any media that requires acting, we see a basis of growing talent across the board, and just the fact that there are more actors in general in the future means that it's very easy to make that criticism that acting is weaker in an older film. But honestly, I didn't see that very much, at least in the main roles. I thought they were all good or fine, and Kirk Douglas was good. I didn't. His face did not annoy me this time.
Yeah.
So positive development there, and yeah. Overall, I was really surprised by the sort of tragic nature of this and the anti-war vibes it gave off. And I think it does a good job of portraying strong messages without alienating any of the viewers in any sort of way. And as a product of its time, I think it stood the test of time, and I think it's a good film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I gave this film a 4.5 out of 5. And me being a war film guy, this is definitely pretty high up there. I think, in terms of older, films during this time, a lot of, especially American ones, were heavily, patriotic and hammed up and supposed to make, it's heavily, nationalist and makes it look really, it makes whatever country in question look really good. And other filmmakers from other countries kind of did similar things. But for the most part, there weren't really too many anti-war movies up to this point, and it's pretty interesting because a lot of people look at Full Metal Jacket and think that that's like one of the best anti-war films ever made, which is also a Kubrick film, of course.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is like the message is so powerful and very blunt and generally kind of easy to understand, and they give you tons of examples of it throughout the whole film. And that, I think, is its best strong suit. And, there's a lot of different scenes. I don't really think there's too many scenes that are that wasted. Maybe towards the end, but but I think for the most part, I mean, this film does an excellent job of really showing, different, like the worst possible aspects of how like a chain of command can, go downhill so easily, and how easily people can take advantage of their authority and things like that. And I think that's it's touched on a lot now, but not at this time. I don't even think I can't think of anything that was nearly this well made at that time.
Yeah.
In the 50s. So yeah, I really, really like it. I like the action sequences, and also, like Zach had mentioned, the camera work is extremely notable and really stands out. I think every World War I movie has pretty much taken that trench pant, like that, whatever Zach's terminology is for that, the camera moving on a dolly or something of that nature, across the whole trench. What is it called, Zach?
Well, that would be a dolly shot or a follow shot. I just wanted to mention, I was really impressed by those because I was looking at the ground in those shots and I thought, where did they put the track? Because usually you would, I mean, especially at that time, since you had a massive camera, you'd put it on the wheeled dolly and then you'd have to put that dolly on a track to go through uneven terrain like that. And we have these wide shots, we can see the ground as we're moving along. They wouldn't have had like a crane system at the time to move it with, or at least I don't think so. And yet you can't see any track at all on the bottom of the trenches where they could have put the dolly to get that smooth of a shot. I thought that was really impressive. I don't know if he had PAs like picking up the track and moving it behind the camera as quickly as possible, but whatever they did, it really worked.
I mean, that's probably, Zach, that's probably what everybody was wondering. Where's the track? That would be the first time they see it. Where's the track in the trench? But I liked all the extras and everything, the tons of extras. All of them had perfect reactions to the explosions and things like that. The whirring and all the different aspects of the explosions and the charge itself. I'm glad they actually showed it, because they almost could have got away with not showing it, but I think it was definitely necessary. And to see that whole sequence play out, to see how it actually happened, and then see the court-martial afterwards, just to know how much of a BS trial it was, and stuff like that. But that's just so well made, and the acting is extremely good from the main characters, Kirk Douglas especially. This is definitely one of his best films, I think. But yeah, I give it a 4 out of 5, and it's definitely one of my favorite war films of this time and of all time. So, my first question would be, or I guess my second one would be, why do you think it was decided to have the morals about the war told during World War I, and more curiously through the French military, especially since they chose to do the French rather than like the British or Americans who would have actually spoken English? And I think we've discussed before, I think we kind of know the reason why they spoke English in this, but what are your opinions on that?
Well, I think I have not read the original book or seen the play that was adapted from the book as the basis for this movie, but I think the book came out in like the mid-30s. So at that point, the main war of reference, I think, would have been World War One. And the reason maybe they used France, I think, would be during World War I, at least, France, I think, took a brunt of the damage of the trench warfare. I'm not a war historian, so you feel free to correct me on this, Mitchell. But I think right. France was where kind of they dug a lot of the trenches and a lot of the warfare actually took place. So I think looking at it from the perspective of people from this country that's taking a lot of the damage, both in terms of people and property, is maybe what Humphrey Cobb, the author, was going for. In terms of everybody speaking English, I think that's just, an aspect so that we, as the viewer, can understand it, as you referenced, Mitchell. At the beginning of the film, I was minorly taken out of the experience by the fact that everybody kind of has different iterations of an accent, despite the fact that they are all speaking English. Like Kirk Douglas, despite the fact that he's meant to be a French commander in this, has a very red-blooded American voice.
Battalion.
Yes, I'm sure, that's a voice that eats mashed potatoes and gravy for breakfast every morning with a side of American skimmed milk. But so I did find that a little distracting at first. But then I thought back to something like Death of Stalin that uses a similar technique, and I thought to like plays and things like that, where typically, sometimes you'll ask an actor to do an accent, but sometimes you won't. And I thought, well, there's different regions of France, there's probably different regional dialects, so if everybody's going to speak English, I'm fine with these different kind of paramutations of the accent. So after that, I was pretty much over it.
Okay.
Yeah, I pretty much feel the same way. I don't have much to add. It was a little distracting at first, but honestly, I could have very easily gone through this whole movie and enjoyed it and had a critical opinion of it without acknowledging or realizing which country this army is supposed to represent.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's kind of just a background detail or something that they need to address for historical accuracy purposes. But I really think it's a testament to the story that they're telling, that the location and the country is not really super important in the grand scheme of things, at least from my perspective.
Right.
So it was a little distracting that there were different accents, but it didn't bother me too much, and I basically agree with what Zach said.
Yeah, and especially because Kubrick is American, so I mean his
Yes.
American upbringing, so that definitely influenced him. But I don't really know the exact specific reason why they chose the French, I guess, in the novel. But I think a good reason why is because, well, the Americans weren't really involved till the very end, and the British kind of have a different background. But I think choosing the French kind of outlines a very specific hypocrisy, because I mean, like the Americans had a revolution, the French also had their own revolution, as we know.
Yeah.
But I think them having their own revolution kind of for the people and things like that, and having a big emphasis on democracy and human rights and things like that, is what makes this so more detrimental. And they also have a lot of the older palaces and things like that, which a lot of this actually takes place in. From that era, I would assume. I think from that era, but I mean, even then, it's just like upper class buildings, things like that. So it's kind of just, I think it just adds a lot to the hypocrisy. And you don't really think, like Christian had said, I don't really think of this being about the French specifically. There's obviously a universal message here about war, but yeah, I think that kind of adds to it, and I think the way that the French were very patriotic during World War I specifically, they especially like during Verdun and things like that, there was a lot of propaganda and stuff like that the French had. But yeah, I mean, it didn't really matter to me that they were speaking English at all. And like Zach had said, actually, Kirk Douglas's accent was kind of bothering me a little bit. But after seeing this enough times, it really just ironed itself out. So not a big deal. But yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. So Kubrick originally intended a happier ending. I don't know why I'm going to the ending, but I think it's important. He intended a happier ending for box office reasons, I guess, because they wanted people to be happier. And the producer submitted the final scripts with the novel ending without consulting the studio, assuming they wouldn't read it, which they didn't. And do you think the three aspects of the ending, which being the firing squad part, the final conversation between the three officers, and the singing part, do they think they fit together well? And which part of the ending was your favorite out of the three?
I loved the ending. The ending made the whole movie for me. I sort of expected Kirk Douglas to heroically save those three men from the firing squad, and I was genuinely stunned when he failed to do that. And I thought the final conversation between him and the higher ranks, so to speak, was sort of the dramatic peak, so like a climax, really was. And it's unusual for a climax of that sort to be placed so close to the end of a film, I think, but it worked really well. And I think it's really powerful that there was this assumption that Kirk Douglas's character was not acting altruistically, but was vying for a promotion. And it's not until the end that the other guy realizes that that's not true, that he's really just a good guy. And
that pisses him off.
Yeah. And
disappoints
final,
him almost.
Yeah. It's like, it's bizarre that that he discovers that there's this higher moral aspiration, and that's a bad thing. And the ending where the soldiers are all bursting into tears, that I thought that was probably the best acting in the entire movie. And for me, the ending, all three parts of the ending, really made the whole movie work. And it is the reason I gave it a positive rating overall. And I would definitely not give this film the rating I did if any of those three, I think, were omitted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the ending, I'm not going to say it made the whole film for me, because technically the rest of the movie really impressed me. But I do think the ending not copping out is a big part of why this has kind of lasted and been remembered. Christian's right. I mean, as I was watching it, I was thinking, oh, well, Kirk Douglas has this this evidence against this guy who's brought these 3 soldiers up on trial, so he's going to blackmail him. And in the firing squad sequence, they cut to that wide shot of all 3, and just as you expect, the trumpet to blare and Kirk Douglas to come riding up on a horse with a cease and desist order, the guns go off, and they just slump over. And it's definitely a situation of you, at least me, being sort of taken aback for a moment. And then I think this ending kind of shows in a lot of ways why Kirk Douglas became a star at the time, specifically that middle portion of the ending. Because throughout a lot of this movie, he's kind of soldier man. He performs fine. He's remembered his lines. He delivers them fine. But I don't think it's until the ending when he says something like, "I may be many things, but I'm not your boy," that you sort of start to see kind of the severity and the seriousness he can bring to a role. And I think that's really magnetic in that sequence and kind of shows a lot of why audiences were attracted to him when he first started to become a star in like the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
And then the ending scene, I think, ties the message of the film up in a perfect little bow. I agree. The 3 scenes that end this movie, I think, are like a perfect pyramid, a perfect thematic pyramid to kind of cut this movie off.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with both of you. I really liked the ending, and I think the first time I saw it, I think I cried, actually,
Wow.
the very end. But, yeah, no, I mean, that was exactly, they answered the exact questions that should have been answered, and they brought everything back to the exact status quo. Everything is exactly going to be exactly the same. Kirk Douglas is just going to be another, cog in the machine, and just like all the other men are all cogs in the machine, and it's exactly, and it wasn't, the best thing about it, like you guys had said it, you were both kind of taken aback from it. I was definitely taken aback from it as well when all 3 of them just get shot. And it's kind of, I mean, it's not one of those things, they really were kind of setting the trajectory as if he almost could have had a chance if he just really broke through his authority and just, stopped everything. And you almost feel like he could have. But then you kind of, then Kubrick kind of like, just takes that away from you, takes that whole, any aspiration of hope or anything that you had about these guys and about how war actually is, and just completely just crushes everything. And it's just the emotional impact of that is definitely, it was originally executed and also, very, very impactful and memorable. So, just in general, what were you saying, Zach?
Sorry, I was just going to say, in a lot of ways, my response to the end of this movie really reminded me of my response to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I don't know if you've seen that, Mitchell, but that's another movie that ends with like, it seems like everything's going to go terribly, and you think, no, these are the guys we like. These are our heroes. They're going to make it out of it. And then, the guns go off, and you're left with just, wait, they died? Like, and you're just left with that. And it really reminded me of kind of my initial response to that movie when I was a wee Billy boy.
Mm-hmm. And I think I didn't totally look into it, but I'm pretty sure the German singer, her song was about a German soldier coming home, and like by the time he came home, his wife was already dead from a sickness or something like that. I think it's kind of hard to translate, but I'm pretty sure that's what the song was about. It's
called The Faithful Hussar. I don't know what a hussar is, but
yeah, it's like a German soldier, basically.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, and then and I also thought that it was interesting that they never actually showed the enemy at all, unless Big Brain they did, because the enemy was inside the whole time.
Oh.
Yeah.
So there you go. That was probably the reason why.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I should have mentioned the ending earlier because it was so impactful. But Kubrick shot 68 takes of that meal scene, the last meal. With the 3 men, and almost every take had like a new roasted duck made to get it exactly right.
Yeah,
he's like, Kubrick's like an insane perfectionist about this stuff. But
yeah,
do you think the scenes with the 3 men like in jail, and I guess on trial, do you think it fits the pacing and tone of the film well? Because I was kind of bothered by it a little bit, and their acting isn't exactly up to par compared to the other actors that we've seen, at least from the 2 generals and the colonel.
Huh.
And do you think there's anything you would have changed or gotten rid of or added to help the effect of their demise at all? Or do you think all of it should be completely unchanged? Or, do you have any like casting recommendations or something?
I mean, I like those scenes with the prisoners a lot. I think in a lot of ways, the scenes with those 3 kind of cooped up is sort of where the main themes of the movie start to reveal themselves, and where you really get to know these guys. I mean, the one guy, you really see changes in their personalities. The one guy is saying like, "Oh well, you guys are gonna die, but I'm gonna get out of here." And then by the end, he's the one who's a sobbing, weeping wreck on the way to death's door. I mean, initially I thought the one guy played by Joe Turkel who gets his skull fractured. I thought, I don't really know why we need this skull fracture here. But then at the end, I think when you see that despite the fact that he's got a fractured skull and can't even stand, that they're still propping him up against the beam to be shot, I think that has a lot of symbolic relevance and the way they treat him despite the fact that he's really injured. So I think that's also important. I definitely wouldn't have taken out those scenes or changed much. I do agree that some of the acting from some of them, I wouldn't call it bad, but I think that aged is maybe, I think it's it's a different technique of acting to a lot of the other people in the film. A lot of kind of the soldiers in the trenches I recognize seem to have been trained with a much more theatrical type acting technique. So in film, they feel a lot bigger. But if everybody was acting like that, I don't think it would be a problem. I just think they stand out from some of the other actors, but I definitely wouldn't call them bad.
Okay. What do you think, Christian?
Yeah, I agree again. Miraculously.
It's a miracle.
Yeah. I think that probably the most important bit for me, besides like the actual ending sequences, are right before those three men are taken to be shot, and the guy that approaches is kind of almost trying to have a normal conversation with the man who's about to be shot and killed, and he's like, he reciprocates that normalness for a moment, and then he just breaks. And I, despite that sort of over the top crying and utter despair, I actually think that it worked really well. And a common critique I would have for older movies that feel slower or are longer would be pacing, but that critique never really occurred to me while watching this movie. So maybe I could nitpick one or two of those scenes, but I wasn't significantly bothered to have that thought myself. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would more or less agree. I don't know. I always felt like they really bothered me for some reason. I felt like Zach had said, the way that they act is a little bit different, and I felt like it was kind of, it was a little straying a little bit too much from the message, I guess. I feel like maybe it's just the way that Kubrick kind of directs, because I kind of feel the same way about the earlier scene with the lieutenant, and we see the effects of that scene later, like the lieutenant just throwing the grenade and running away, which is kind of funny when I first saw that. And then I learned the repercussions. But yeah, I was like, why would they just throw that in there, like just as another thing? And then he comes back later, and then that scene with Kirk Douglas, that fixes it basically. Yeah. But it adds another point against the film for me until it corrects itself, and that kind of bothers me. I feel like it kind of affects the way that I look at the general message as a whole a little bit. And I understand it's like a way of creating it, but in my opinion, it's not not my favorite way. I think it was a little too out there, and then just have it explained way later in the movie is a little weird, jarring, I guess.
I think. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think the lieutenant that you mentioned who just throws the grenade and runs, I think I would say at least he's maybe the weakest performer in this. Not because he's a weak actor, because I can't remember that actor's name, but I've seen him in other stuff from like television in the 50s and in other movies from earlier than that. And he's fine. I mean, he's not incredible, but he doesn't stand out as being weak. But he, to me, stands out the most as like, I was taught in theater to very clearly say each and every line, quite slowly. And it's totally different from any other actor in the film and really sticks out like a sore thumb.
Yeah, and I guess on the topic of acting, we could talk about General Miro, and that's George McCready, and then compared to Kirk Douglas's Colonel Dax. And how do you, between the two performances, which one do you think struck home more with you? Like, which one, struck a chord with you a lot more?
Now, is McCready the one with the scar, or is he the guy that... Okay, all right.
Yep.
Well, I would say... I think in a lot of ways, Kirk Douglas is an actor that's a lot more commanding in his role. than the general, but I think that's kind of intentional. I think you're meant to see the general kind of as a bit of a sniveling, not necessarily coward, but I don't think he's meant to have that sort of magnetic quality that Kirk Douglas does have in his role. I think you're meant to look to Kirk Douglas as kind of a much more heroic man than the general, and that's kind of meant to highlight how it's not necessarily heroes who get put in positions of power in war. It's people who know how to think in the ways that will give them power and that can kind of distance them from the men that they command. So I think that's kind of the specific highlight. So even though Kirk Douglas is a more attractive performer and you're drawn more towards him as a viewer, I do think
Unless you don't like his face.
I guess unless you don't like his face, but I think they both play their roles perfectly fine within the story itself.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely liked Kirk Douglas's character more just because he was more likable and he was the protagonist, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I mean, I probably had a stronger emotional reaction to McCready because I hated him. I hated his guts, which is good, which means he did his job.
Yeah.
So I mean, they were both fine, but I guess maybe it's just because I had some bias against Kirk Douglas going into this, which definitely eroded throughout the course of the movie. But, I would say a stronger emotional reaction to the villain, but definitely liked the hero more for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry.
What, Zach? What?
If I may, I'm sorry I keep interrupting you on this, Mitchell.
It's okay.
But I was just going to say, I think maybe the reason you had more of a negative reaction to Kirk Douglas in the final countdown is that that's one of his latter-day roles, and he's kind of physically and, I mean, to some extent mentally, because he wasn't a particularly well man at the time, he's kind of sort of aged out of that movie star position, and yet the movie puts him in a role that insists that he's still a star, he's Kirk Douglas, you love him. And I think part of that is kind of, as a viewer, you're sort of reluctant to accept that, and maybe a little annoyed by that in the final countdown, as opposed to here, where he's in that peak movie star condition that gave him sort of that reputation in the first place.
Makes sense.
I particularly liked General Miro. I don't want to say liked. I was intrigued by his villainy more than I was intrigued by Kirk Douglas's character's heroism. And part of the reason why is because of how expressive and how in your face and blunt he is about everything, how so hyper confident he is about it. And being in kind of a pseudo military environment the past few years and seeing how people actually are, and then reading it and like talking to veterans and things like that, and then seeing like the personification of that, a very realistic personification of that, in fact, on screen, I think is really impactful. And I think he does a magnificent job of being expressive and having very memorable lines and very memorable conversations and strong defense against his arguments and things like that, because he sounds like he really knows what he's talking about. And he in a lot of ways he might, but obviously he's a terrible person and we see that unroll. But I mean, he's so confident and in your face and knows everything about the military and is entirely like a super strong authority figure. Like he's a force to be reckoned with, and he's less of a physical, obviously, or a like strong in numbers type of guy. He's like emotionally strong and intellectually strong, and that's like the worst type of villain you can have within your ranks in the military environment. And to see Kirk Douglas face off with him and show his true colors as an actor, I think is a really unique thing to see happen on screen, especially this earlier on in Kubrick's directing career.
I do want to mention, though, I really like how they gave Moreau the scar. There are a lot of people throughout this movie who have scars, and usually I would say, it's just a typical villain thing. But I think here it emphasizes that Moreau probably got that in the trenches, and Moreau probably was at some point in the position of Kirk Douglas's character. So I think in a way, once you start thinking about it, it kind of humanizes him to a certain extent. It doesn't make him just a Machiavellian, I'm the villain, I'm going to push them into the trenches and look at my scar. Like, I think it emphasizes, like, he was once in the position that these men were in. He was afraid, he risks his life, and things being what they may, the great wheel turned and he just happened to end up on top with some facial scarring, but he's on top now and he's going to do what he can with it.
And he's following the rule book while doing it, or at least,
Yeah.
to enough of an extent where even if he does go against it, he can just, walk right over it.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's what, leads the message with the whole anti-war thing. But yeah, I mean, I really liked his character. He's one of my favorite, I guess, villains that's not, an obvious villain in a war movie. But yeah, do you think, this is completely different, do you think the action scenes worked well, and do you think the cinematography helped them, or do you think they aged a little bit too much to be taken too seriously?
I mean, oh, sorry, Zach.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I don't think that, I think as long as you recognize in the back of your head that this movie came out in 1957, that it's not really a fair critique to say that they didn't age particularly well, because
Right.
I think given the time period they work just fine, and it is kind of like minutes upon minutes of explosions for a bit there in the middle, but it serves its purpose, and I'm not as much of a technical cinephile as Zach is, but as far as I could tell, they seemed well directed as much as the rest of the movie was, and I didn't really have an issue with it. I think it was kind of in some ways a necessary break, because there's a lot of talking before that. That's also a common critique I have of older films. There's a lot of talking and not a lot of things happening, and I think that is not true in this, thanks to these explosions and these battle sequences. So in that sense, I think it served its purpose in keeping an audience engaged, and I don't think they aged terribly at all.
I think they hold up pretty well. I think there's a distinction that you have to draw between, I wouldn't necessarily call them action sequences, because generally I would say the purpose of an action sequence is to be exciting and to get the audience up on their feet and with the character doing whatever they're doing. I think the purpose of these war sequences and the sequences where, say, they're charging the anthill are more to be impressive and show you the scope of what's going on, rather than to get you up clapping in the seats or anything like that. And with that in mind, I think they do impress. There's one certain shot where the camera follows Kirk Douglas out of the trench and across no man's land for a couple feet, and you see the men running behind him and the explosions going off. And I think that shot is a great testament to what you can do with good direction, a well-placed camera, and not even a huge amount of extras, but just a mediocre number of extras. Because there aren't many people in that shot, and they probably shot it in like a skip somewhere. Like they didn't go to France to shoot that. I'm pretty sure they probably just found like, okay, well, here's some mounds of hills. Let's dig some holes and put the explosives over there, and everybody run. And the way they filmed it, it's totally convincing. Like in that moment, I was like, well, that's no man's land. I'm in this.
Yeah.
So I think they hold up really well. The only bits that I think maybe don't hold up as well there are a couple, I think they're miniature shots of no man's land that are meant to be from the perspective of people peering over like the side at the anthill, and those look a little small. They look kind of like we're going into the land of make-believe and Mr. Rogers, but I think everything else holds up pretty well.
It's a beautiful day.
It's a beautiful day in the trenches.
Yeah, seeing a lot of American war films at this time, and obviously before it, like right after World War II, or maybe even during World War II, there's a lot of artificial drama and a lot of added on things. Like when somebody gets shot, they're super expressive. It's like they pause for a photo op, and then they're like, it goes like, nah, 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 and he's like falling over, and there's like no bullet holes in him at all a lot of the time. It's just he just freaking falls over and is dead. Yeah. And that's one of the, for somebody who watched a lot of them because of my parents, thanks Dad, and watched things like Combat and stuff like that later on. I really like that type of thing. But in this, there's a lot less to be happy about.
Oh, no.
And I'm not as happy when I see people die. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't be happy to see French people or American people die. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that it's like you're like, oh, like when you see like an American guy get shot in an older war film, but then when you see a French guy's dying, you're like, oh man, oh no, like things are blowing up.
Man.
There's artillery. We gotta get out of here. And like Zach said, like you're totally in the moment, and the age actually helps in this respect, because when there's not actual like, you know, super close up like shots, or like you know, when they're very like, when it's like, yeah, like Zach had said, those shots where it looked like Mr. Rogers, but those shots do not age well. But in every other aspect, the wide shots and the charging and stuff like that, I think you could almost say, if you weren't educated, you wouldn't even think that it was made in the 50s. You could almost believe it's like a World War One, you know, actual video from World War One. A lot of the time.
Yeah.
Then you see Kirk Douglas's face, and then you're disappointed. But yeah, I mean, I think the sounds work really well. There's a lot of you know, dynamic sounds in this. I don't think there's too many that are like, anytime it's recycled, I think it really fits the moment. Like the after the artillery gets fired off and stuff like that. I think that just adds tons of tension and, you know, stuff that you wouldn't really see at movies at that time. But I think it really holds up well, and based on what they had at the time, I think there's a lot of good practical scenes, and you know, the way that people die and stuff is very realistic. So I think it's a really good job, and I definitely think that they added those scenes not just because it was like, oh, we have a lot of talking, so let's have the audience, you know, believe it more. I think it was more like a combination between Kubrick being a perfectionist and then also people in the 50s not being riveted. If there's talking for 5 minutes, they just are like, I thought this was a war movie.
Yeah.
So any war movie, they would have to advertise as being like, oh, there's a bunch of shooting, and Kirk Douglas is going to shoot people into explosions and the woo, and everything like that.
I did recognize the tagline on the poster of this movie is very sensationalistic.
Yes.
It goes into no man's land. No picture has ever gone into before.
Now the screen blasts open the bombshell story of a colonel who led his regiment into hell and back.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's a lot of films at that time. So.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, this film did not stray in that direction at all. It had a very clear message. So I really liked those action sequences. They were very well incorporated, in my opinion. And I guess my final question would be, the France banned the film until 1975, as did other countries such as Switzerland, ironically because of their bias against the French army. Like, oh, the French are banning it, so we have to ban it. Does that sound familiar? But are the message you interpreted, are they too political, or do you think that they're relatively realistic and shouldn't be necessarily taken as a biased message or biased anti-war message?
I didn't necessarily perceive it as that political at all. And I'm going to harken back to my previous comments where it didn't feel like the French military was an active factor in it. It felt more like a general commentary about the dangers of those in positions of power and the ability that they have to abuse said power. And I think this movie would work just as well if it was about literally any other country or military ever, as long as you maintain those performances in the same framework. And in that sense, I don't see it as political, or at least it didn't feel like a specific political message for or against any nation or alliance. So I'm definitely not in favor of censoring it or banning it in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I did some reading up on this as well. I definitely agree that I don't necessarily think this movie is an attempted jab at the French military or anything like that. But in a lot of ways, I can kind of understand the viewpoint that the French government was coming from when they chose to ban it. Because if you look at this movie purely factually, it's a movie that says that during World War I, the people in charge of the French military didn't care about the men at all and just sent them in to die. And whether that may be true or not, to varying degrees, if you're French and you're somebody who's in a position of power, maybe in the military, you're going to look at that and say, well, wait a minute, you're saying I don't care about my men. You're saying we don't care about our people. I'm not having any of that. Like, yeah. I can kind of understand where that response came from. Do I think it's reasonable? Not really, but I can understand why the decision to ban it was made. I'm glad it's lifted at this point, but I can kind of understand that thinking to a certain extent.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of you. I don't I can definitely see how and why they would be offended, especially because it was made by Americans and there's Americans portraying French as to make it look further like they're just ignorant and they don't understand. But I think as long as you're knowledgeable and you have a general understanding of how the military works and why certain wars were fought and what certain perspectives were had, and you have a general understanding of that, I think you can easily get through this movie not thinking there's any political message. I think if you look at it way too surface level, there's a lot that you can pick up on that you really shouldn't be looking into at all. And it's just, you're pretty much missing the message at that point. But, I mean, if you know anything, I mean, the French obviously did an amazing job in World War I, and there were definitely generals that were very similar to this, had very, obviously not exactly like this, but had plenty of aspects like that. And Kubrick's point, obviously, is that every military has that problem. And they will always have that problem because it's a part of the human condition to have that problem in wars. Hence why this is an anti-war film. But I mean, I didn't feel a punch like therefore wars should not be fought message at the very end with all the soldiers singing, and there's all these soldiers are very human. Yeah. And they obviously everyone in this film is humanized to a certain extent where they're believable, and it's all a relatively realistic situation, more or less. But I mean, no, I didn't think this was very political at all. There's obviously a message that could be controversial to some people. But I think most people that understand how and why war and diplomacy is the way that it is and what causes human beings to be this way in positions of authority. And I think if you understand that universal message, then I don't think you should have any sentiments, for or against anything in regards to politics. But I think that's another a way of how beautiful this film is as well. I think it's less political, if at all, than Full Metal Jacket, because Full Metal Jacket is Vietnam War is a lot more controversial than World War I. Surface level. Okay, but we we can all watch that at some point, not at the podcast, but some other time.
I think Dr. Strangelove kind of has a similar message about sort of the distance that the people in charge of war have from the people who are fighting it and who are affected by it. Yeah.
Right, and you kind of have
It seems to be something Kubrick comes back to. So.
Right. Man, Zach, I'm going to have to come out. How dare you? How dare you?
How dare I?
Yeah, how dare you? You have Animal Mother firing off from the Huey and stuff. You don't trail them as much and stuff like that. And I'm just using that as a very distinct example because although that does not represent every soldier's opinion, obviously, there were soldiers like that were under those types of sentiments because of the way that humans are and the way that they react to the materials that are given to them. If you put them in certain situations, this is how they're going to act. So if you have this military construct, this is how things are going to play out, is essentially what Kubrick is saying in both films. But if you guys don't have any other thoughts, we can go on to the rundown.
Oh.
Sounds good to me.
1
minute. We grill Zach with words and phrases pertaining to the film we just discussed, and Zach responds with a rating out of 5 for each. Mitchell, are you willing to start us off this time? Excellent. On your mark, get set, go.
Pregnable defenses.
3 out of 5.
Stanley Kubrick.
4 out of 5.
Evil Man's Scar.
3 out of 5.
Kirk Douglas's Face.
3 out of 5.
Dying on a Beautiful Day.
3 out of 5.
Asking soldiers if they're married.
2 out of 5.
Red Skim Milk.
3 out of 5.
Not believing in shell shock.
2 out of 5.
3 officers at a round table being awfully familiar.
3 out of 5.
Filmmaking in the 50s.
4 out of 5.
Taking the court's time with technicalities.
3 out of 5.
Explosions.
3 out of 5.
Poison Duck.
2 out of 5.
Waltz music that sounds like it's a small world.
2 out of 5.
Do not be afraid to ask for credit, for a way of refusing is very polite.
4 out of 5.
Idealism.
3 out of 5.
Epic snare drumming.
3 out of 5.
Christian Kubrick as the only woman to speak.
3 out of 5.
And we had a second to spare. Isn't that delightful?
Wow, I think that's the first time we've done that in a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was good. Good list. All right. Well, like Christian, I have no freaking idea who the next person is.
That would be me.
Yeah.
Oh, it's Christian. There you go.
Yeah,
There we
yeah.
go.
On to you. The torch passes.
Our next film will be let's call it a mystery thriller of sorts called The Usual Suspects, directed by Bryan Singer, starring Kevin Spacey, Gabriel Byrne, among others. Yeah, unfortunately. But we're going to examine this film and try to separate the performances from the performers. And I think it's a classic for a reason. And I would highly advise any of our listeners to watch this movie before listening to a podcast about it. Because that first viewing experience before you know the events of the film is really important for this film in particular, I would say. So we hope to see you then.
Han Solo dies. Okay.
I think that goes for any movie we watch. Try and watch it beforehand, because we spoil everything.
Yeah, we sure do.
Yep, all three of the soldiers get shot at the end.
I'd forgotten.
And then a woman sings and everyone cries, and it's very sad.
Yes, it is. This is very sad.
Yes. Okay, this has been Cookie Pocket, episode 18? I already forgot.
Yeah, 18, yeah.
18! Garrigus. Episode 18 of Cookie Pocket, an attempted podcast. This has been Paths of Glory, and we will see you next time.